Hello, everybody. My name is Irina Pert, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinars from the series Understanding Sobornost. These seminars have been already carried for more than a year at the University of Tartu, School of Theology and Religious Studies. And this is part of a research project called Orthodoxy as Solidarity, Conciliar and Popular Orthodoxy in Estonia in the long 20th century. And the members of the project, some of them are here, and one member of our project, Andrei Shishkov, will be this seminar moderator. So I will pass the floor to him. Hello, Andrei.
Hello, Irina. Thank you. I am glad to introduce our today's speaker, Daniel Scarborough, who is an associate professor of history at the School of the Humanities and Social Sciences of the Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. Daniel studied philosophy at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, before moving to Russia in 2001 to teach English as a Peace Corps volunteer, and he taught English in different towns of Russia, and returned then to Russia in 2007 to conduct archival research in Moscow and Tver as a Fulbright Hays Fellow. And in 2012, he earned his PhD in Russian history from Georgetown University and continued to teach Russian and European history in the different universities of the DC area, Georgetown, Marymount, and Howard universities. And from 2013 to 2015, Daniel taught Russian religious history and global Christianity at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. From 2015, he began teaching Russian history at Nazarbayev University in Astana. This year, Daniel published his book, Russia's Social Gospel, the Orthodox Pastoral Movement in Famine, War, and Revolution. It was published by the University of Wisconsin Press. And today he will speak on Sobornost among the parish clergy in Imperial Russia. Please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you, Irina, for inviting me to be part of this seminar. It's been really fascinating to attend, and I'm very honored to be presenting at it. I didn't circulate a title for this talk, but if I had it, it would have been something like Revolution and Canon Law and Sobornost among the parish clergy. This is from the last chapter of my book, and so it's too late for me to correct anything, but I'll still be very happy to hear your comments afterwards. I'm taking a portion of this chapter to discuss today. My book in general is about Irina asked me to say a few things about it. It's about the reaction of the parish clergy of the Orthodox Church in late Imperial Russia to humanitarian challenges, catastrophes, war, famine, revolution, and the associations that emerged from that, first of all within the clerical estate, and later transcending the boundaries of that estate. And I call it Russia's social gospel. This is, of course, the name of an American religious movement, but I think there are some similarities, namely the grassroots origins of this reaction to social problems. So I can say more about that at the end if anyone is interested, but this particular chapter focuses on 1917 and how the church survived 1917. So at that point, like most of Russian society, the church was deeply divided. And there were really contentious issues dividing roughly the episcopate, the monastic hierarchy, from the parish clergy, the priests, and the laity. So the monastic hierarchy wanted greater independence from the state bureaucracy. They were pushing for a church council, a Sobor, to reform the church and to reassert their apostolic authority. The parish clergy were resentful of the power that the bishops had wielded in their diocese over them throughout the synodal period. So they were there was a lot of animosity toward the bishops on the part of the priests. The sacristans or psalomshiki wanted greater equality with the priests, so they wanted more of the resources that were being used to support the parish clergy. And the laity were resentful of the burden, the financial burden that was placed on them to support the clergy, the church, and the fact especially that they did not control the finances that they were contributing to the church. And so with all of these divisions, it's actually remarkable that the church was able to reform itself and to emerge from 1917 as really the only institution of Tsarist Russia that did not collapse, although it of course did have to endure the Soviet persecution. And so what I argue in this chapter is that the emergence of the church intact was the result of a compromise between these different parties. And that compromise was facilitated, first of all, in large part by the associations that the parish clergy had created to administer the diocese, namely the diocesan congresses, eparchialnie съезды, which first of all emerged in 1917 as revolutionary organs, but ended up serving as a forum for compromise. And I also argue that it was through the discourse of canon law that this ultimate compromise was possible. So what happened in 1917 in the church was what's been called a revolutionary moment in the Orthodox Church. So in all of the dioceses, all 67 dioceses of the church, these diocesan congresses of clergy and laity assembled, in many cases without the consent of the bishop. Traditionally, the bishop was supposed to give permission for these congresses to convene. In many cases, they did not. And by one count, 15 of these congresses actually deposed their bishops and elected new ones. So despite their efforts to radically reform ecclesiastical authority structure, the clergy, the parish clergy depended on the church's institutional integrity in order to endorse their status as ordained pastors. So we have this revolutionary moment where there's this revolt against the episcopate, but then there's also a revolt from below. There's a revolt on the part of the sacristans, and the laity are all in some cases seizing church land, seizing church resources. And so the parish clergy end up resisting overt transgression of canon law in the context of these diocesan congresses, in order to retain the institutional integrity, in order to retain respect for their status as ordained pastors. There's one quote that I found in Tver by one delegate to Tver's diocesan congress. He says, the priests are sawing off the limb on which they sit by revolting against the bishop. They're going to get rid of their bishop, and then the sacristans and the peasants are going to come home and say, well, priest, now we're going to do to you what you did to the bishop. And so because of that anxiety, I argue, the clergy would end up stressing canon law in their efforts to reform church governance. So I'm going to focus today on Moscow, on what happened in Moscow, because that was central to this revolutionary moment, to church reform. And of course, that was the place where the Sobor would take place. But before the famous Sobor of 1917 and 18, which restored the patriarchate and placed Tikhon Pilyavin in the patriarchate, before that happened, there was first of all a diocesan congress which deposed the Metropolitan of Moscow and replaced him with Tikhon, and also organized an empire-wide forum, the so-called All-Russian Congress of Clergy and Laity, which was a national gathering of representatives from diocesan congresses throughout the empire. And I also argue that this Congress exerted an influence on the Sobor, and that in order to understand how the Sobor unfolded, we really need to understand what happened before it in Moscow. So just a few words about canon law. This is of course church law. It's based on the New Testament, the apostolic canons, rules of the ecumenical councils, certain statements of the church fathers. And in the 19th century in Russia, appeals to canon law were made to argue for the church's right to administer its own affairs independently of the state. This was first of all brought up by the bishops who wanted to get out from under the synodal system, and they protested against certain things. For example, the transfer of bishops from diocese to diocese. They would argue that this was uncanonical. But the weakness of canon law as a source of authority was that there was no independent arbiter of what was and was not canonical. So it could be interpreted in many ways, and it was often referred to rhetorically, that this is canonical or uncanonical. And so by the 1850s, high-ranking prelates had begun to call for an all-church council or Sobor to discuss church reform independently of the synod. And this movement also drew inspiration from the concept of Sobornost, the topic of this seminar. So this is a theory, of course, of ecclesiastical authority based on collective decision-making on the model of the ecumenical councils. And for the monastic hierarchy, Sobornost was largely supposed to be confined to those with apostolic authority, to the bishops. But the Slavophiles, who popularized this concept, had applied Sobornost more broadly, even to the peasant commune, and to many forms of voluntary assembly. So their inclusive understanding of Sobornost was also referred to support a vision of ecclesiastical reform in which canonical authority or canon law would be determined through more broad-based participation. So there were many scholars of canon law in the 19th century who advocated for some kind of electoral principle or выборное начало in church administration, so that the Orthodox community could participate in its own governance through elected representatives. So this Professor Golubinsky, for example, of canon law at Moscow Theological Academy, argued that the personal authority wielded by the bishops within their diocese was uncanonical, and that, quote, the status of the members of the board with the bishops, known as consistories, should have a voice that is not merely consultative, but authoritative, like that of the bishop himself. So that's one example. Another of these professors, Vasily Mushtin, also at Moscow Theological Academy, went further. He argued that in a Reformed church, the apostolic authority of the bishop should be supported by the active participation of the entire diocesan community. And his comments reveal the importance that the concept of Sobornost had in the study of canon law, which he equated with canonicity. So, quote, the Soborno-canonical principle demands that the new institution of diocesan administration should be an organ not of episcopal power, but of the whole diocese, end quote. So that's, his position was a bit more radical than most, but it's very interesting that he used that term, Soborno-canoniический принцип. So defenders of the exclusivity of apostolic authority viewed the movement for more participatory church administration as a result of the fetishization of contemporary political ideas of the Zemstva constitutionalists. Yet there were many Orthodox intellectuals and members of the clergy who viewed the electoral principle as an instrument for reorganizing apostolic authority on a more subordinate or conciliatory basis, conciliary basis. Okay, so moving on to the specific situation in Moscow. So as I mentioned, there were many of these cases in which the bishops were attacked by the diocesan congresses over the spring and summer of 1917. This was the case in Moscow. It went rather smoothly because the bishop there was so unpopular. This was Makary Nevsky, who was thought to have been installed by Rasputin through the influence of Rasputin in 1912. The Tsar in that year had rejected all of the synod's candidates for the See of Moscow and just appointed this Archbishop Makary, who was 82 years old, from the Diocese of Tomsk and Altai to the cosmopolitan Diocese of Moscow. And so Makary was preaching to people about how to form your fingers correctly when you're making the sign of the cross, and how to bow to icons correctly. So he was very based on ritual, and he was very out of place in Moscow and very unpopular. And he really exemplified the problems with the synodal system, especially the episcopate's vulnerability to manipulation by the state. So under the organizational leadership of Moscow's Organization of United Clergy, as they called themselves, the Diocesan Congress convened in March of 1917 without Makary's consent. And there were a small number of priests who opposed the Congress. Ivan Vastorgov, the sort of notorious conservative priest who was the dean at that time of St. Basil's Cathedral, he protested, he resigned, but the majority of the priests of Moscow voted to encourage Makary to resign. And this is how it was normally done. The diocesan congresses stopped short of claiming the authority to actually command the prelate to step down. In most cases, they would exert pressure on him to do so, because again, they recognized that they did not have the canonical authority to force a prelate out of office, but they would simply say, nobody likes you, please leave. And in the case of Moscow, they ended up getting the support of the synod, especially the support of Lvov, who was the overprocurator, who was appointed by the provisional government. And this guy was very radical, and he would eventually become a member of the Renovationist church under the Soviet regime. And so the synod kind of urged Makary to step down voluntarily, And Makary basically said, okay. Then he went back to Moscow and he looked around and he got really angry. And so he said, I changed my mind. I'm not going to step down. And he started citing canon law. He cited the Apostolic Canons 39 and 55, as well as the canons from the Fourth Ecumenical Council and the Second Council of Constantinople, all of which had to do with episcopal authority. And he declared that any priest who removed his name from the liturgy would be suspended. But at that point, because he had already acquiesced before the synod, Lvov was able to say, just ignore what this guy says. He's no longer the bishop. And the synod appointed Iosif, Bishop Iosif, in his place as a temporary replacement. At this point, the Diocesan Congress in Moscow made some rhetorical references to canon law. This archpriest Nikolai Tsvetkov, who was the chairman of the diocese, publicly named Lvov as a, quote, supporter of the church's emancipation and development on the principle of canonical freedom. What did this mean exactly? It was a bit vague. As I said, it's more of a rhetorical reference. So what he seems to have meant was the freedom of the parish clergy to assemble and to participate in the church's administration, and ultimately to elect a new prelate. And the synod was cooperating. The synod endorsed this aspiration, and on July 5th, it would pass the, quote, common regulations for the election of diocesan bishops. But the Moscow's Diocesan Congress did not wait for that. They already began developing their own rules for elections. And they further resolved to provide a national forum, or an empire-wide forum, at which representatives from all of the diocesan congresses could assemble and meet independently of the hierarchy and discuss church reform. So it was kind of like the church's version of Soyuz Soyuzov, the Union of Unions. And it would convene on June 1st with 1,268 delegates, according to the representative norm of one clergyman and one layman for every 100 churches, as well as one monk and one seminary representative from each diocese. So this is a very interesting assembly that is overshadowed by the Sobor, which followed it, but which again, I think exerted a strong influence on how the Sobor unfolded. So a prominent goal of this All-Russian Congress of Clergy and Laity was the social and spiritual integration of Orthodox Christians through church reform. And they made some real honest attempts to reintegrate the laity with the parish clergy, to bridge some of these disagreements. And so one of the most dramatic moves in this direction was to grant the parish the rights of a legal entity, юридическое лицо. And this is something that activists had been calling for a long time. Alexander Popkov, you may know this name. He was a prominent activist for parish reform. So Alexander Popkov, along with a lot of other prominent Orthodox intellectuals, attended this assembly, and it was he who announced that from here on out, the parish community is the legal owner of parish property, as opposed to the church in general. So up until this point, anything that the laity contributed to their parish would then be the property of the church and could be used for the seminary, could be used for any variety of causes for the Irina, you're asking a question? No, I thought you were raising your hand. The fear was that if the parish community was given ownership over this, everything that they contributed to their religious life, to the church, if they were given ownership over that, they would keep it in the parish. They would use it only for the parish, and the seminaries would be bankrupted, and all of the other diocesan institutions would be bankrupted. Basically, the infrastructure for an educated clergy would collapse, and that's why it was resisted for so long. But what I argue in my book is that gradually more and more control over church resources was being transferred to the laity. And this was kind of the final step in that process. Now that the Tsarist regime was gone, in any case, the parish clergy at this diocesan forum basically said, okay, this is a Hail Mary. The laity now are in control, and we certainly hope that they will continue to fund the seminaries and other institutions. So there was a great deal of enthusiasm. There were a lot of statements that, you know, now the church is one again. Now we are standing together before Christ as one church, and we're overcoming our divisions through this reform, through integration, by convening these assemblies and these councils. We will overcome our divisions. But there were also a lot of statements of concern, even among these delegates. And so prominent among these was Sergei Bulgakov, who said, who made the statement that democracy could be as much an idol, as much of a problem for the church as autocracy had before. So what he said was, quote, "The earthly trinity of democracy, the Soviet of peasants, workers, and soldiers' deputies, like the despotism of Roman emperors, can never replace the trinity of heaven," end quote. And other delegates raised similar concerns, that the plans to form a democratic alliance of clergy and laity were driven more by politics than by Sobornost, and that this could degrade the canonical authority of the church. And so a particular point of concern in that vein was the absence, the near exclusion of bishops from the Congress. So this was, although there were efforts to integrate clergy and laity, there was still a definite rift with the hierarchy, with the monastic hierarchy. So only 7 bishops ended up attending this Congress. And not everyone was happy with that. Protests erupted when the archpriest Svetkov announced that the Congress's chairman should hold the rank of presbyter but should not be a bishop, as the workload would be too large for a busy prelate. He stated rather facetiously, I think. Delegates raised concern that the revolt against the hierarchy could weaken the unity of the church as a whole. And so one bishop who did attend, Platon Rozhdestvensky, who was the exarch of Georgia, addressed the delegates on behalf of the synod and made some very flattering comments about the diocesan congresses in general. He said, "All the recent diocesan congresses have been vigorous. The breadth of their views, the depth of their thought, and the strength of their feelings are all features of the free Russian church," end quote. So that was kind of a remarkable statement, considering the fact that many bishops were very unhappy with these congresses that were meeting without their permission, and especially those who had been asked to leave their diocese. So he made that very diplomatic statement, and also without making direct reference to this problem, this dispute between the parish clergy and the hierarchy. He warned that a divided church would not survive in the politically unstable environment of 1917. He said, quote, "We must believe that the church united and organized, can live without the state. Join together, you delegates of our Orthodox Russian Church, strengthen your position as a church, prove that you can live not only separately, but also in one common moral organization, end quote. So his diplomatic circumspection kind of reveals that the parish clergy had made a show of force in Moscow. They had gathered delegates from throughout the empire or the former empire, and that the hierarchy recognized that. But he also very cautiously voiced the concern of many of the participants of this Congress itself, that this church revolution, by weakening the authority of the hierarchy, was degrading the prestige of the church itself among the population. And so after this Congress concluded, there was another diocesan Congress in Moscow, specifically to address the issue of the See of Moscow. And this one was a lot more cautious and a lot more attentive to canon law, possibly because of the concerns that had been expressed at the All-Russian Congress. So the first diocesan Congress in Moscow in March, as I said, had made reference to canon law, rhetorical reference to canon law, but really it had enjoyed the support of the synod. It was kind of an inversion of what had been the case before, where the government, the synod, was propping up the almost absolute authority of the bishop in the diocese. Now the overprocurator is on the side of the parish clergy, and they had basically used that authority to turn the tables. Now in I don't see the month that this was. I want to say, anyway, I won't say, July perhaps. The next diocesan Congress was much more careful, as I want to say, much more careful in its justification of its actions. So the organizational committee to prepare for elections of the new Metropolitan of Moscow cited, for example, chapter 1 of the book of Acts, which describes the election of Matthias as the 12th apostle to replace Judas. Quote, 11 elected the 12th with the participation of all the brothers, about 120 people, end quote. They also cited the historical precedent of the ancient church in which bishops were elected by their flock. And so this committee developed a 3-stage electoral procedure, which would give the parish clergy 50% of the vote, and the laity, both men and women, would provide the other 50% of the vote in the next diocesan Congress. Ultimately, more than 800 delegates would comprise this Congress, which would elect the new prelate. An assembly of bishops would preside over the election and confirm its outcome, but would not themselves cast votes. Each stage of the process would be initiated by prayer and treated as a sacred act. The author of a report on this process, actually he was anonymous, I assume he was a layperson, expressed exasperation at the amount of time and effort that had been dedicated to the canonical justification of the election. He says, quote, "The canons of the church are a sphere that is far from accessible for everyone. This field, moreover, is not so intelligible or rational, even for those who are acquainted with it. The ancient canons belong to a distant era. Just try to apply them to the 20th century," end quote. So the committee's, the Moscow committee's specific canonical arguments were obviously not for popular consumption. They were intended to forge a compromise with the hierarchy and with the synod, which in turn was for the benefit of the public, to to see that the church was still whole, was still united. And it succeeded in this aim, as the committee's electoral procedure was ultimately adopted by the synod on July 5th. So the synod's compliance was a major victory for the Moscow Union of Clergy and Laity, as it was now calling itself. But the election itself still posed a major risk because of the candidates. So who was standing for election as the next prelate of Moscow? There was Archbishop Sergei Starogorodsky, who would actually become patriarch later. He was at that time Archbishop of Finland. Archbishop Andrei Ukhtomsky of Ufa, Archbishop Tikhon, obviously, Bilavin of Lithuania, Archbishop Platon Rождественский, who had been at the Congress, and Moscow's temporary prelate, who had been put in place of Makary temporarily, that was Bishop Iosif Kalistov. But there was also a very popular candidate, Alexander Samarin, who was a layman, who had been previously the overprocurator of the synod in 1915. And he was very popular because he had stood up to Rasputin, and he had been dismissed because of his opposition to Rasputin. He was a fairly moderate figure, but he really became the candidate of anti-episcopal sentiment. And just as an interesting aside, if you know this painting in the Tretyakov gallery, the Девочка с персиками, this young girl with fruit, it's a very famous painting. She's 11 years old at the time of the painting. That was his wife. When she grew up, she actually died in 1907, tragically. So because he was a widower, he was technically, according to canon law, eligible to become a prelate, although this had never been done in the history of the Russian Church. There had never been a layman elevated to the position of a bishop. On the day before the election, a prominent Moscow priest, Father Kedrov, made a speech in which he recalled that when the monastic clergy, standing at the head of the church's administration, had not raised their voices against Rasputin's influence over the church, Samarin had spoken out and was forced to leave as a consequence. So that's why he was very popular. Of the other elections that were taking place throughout the former empire at this point, to replace those 15 bishops who had been expelled or encouraged to leave by the diocesan congresses, two of the people elected were laymen, and both of them would be rejected by the synod. The synod accepted I believe all the other cases except for those two. One was a seminary inspector. Actually, the other one was an archimandrite. He was not a layman, but he did not hold the rank of bishop. So the synod had rejected those cases. And so the question is, if Samarin had been elected, what would have happened? This might very well have caused a schism in the church, at the very least a crisis. And so the diocesan congress met in, yes, I was right, June 19th, in the Yeparchialny Dom, Moscow's Yeparchialny Dom. And this is the same building where the Sobor would be convened shortly thereafter. The first votes were cast the next day. Tikhon and Samarin were the front runners. Each of them received an equal number of votes, amazingly, 297, putting them far ahead of any other candidates. Many of Tikhon's supporters saw him as a mild prelate who, in the words of Tsvetkov, that chairman of the All-Russian Congress, quote, always allowed local social forces the broadest autonomy, end quote. But I think this faction was also motivated by caution. There was another priest, Father Bogolyubsky, who was a leading supporter of Tikhon, who argued that, quote, the candidacy of a layman, meaning Samarin, may give rise to temptation among the wide mass of simple Orthodox people. Thus, unless there is great need, we should not forget the old system of election from among the existing episcopate, end quote. So Moscow's diocesan revolutionaries were divided by the concern that a drastic break with tradition and with the episcopate would compromise the status, not just of the episcopate, but of the parish clergy as well among the laity. Tikhon also drew support from the more conservative clergymen, while Samarin's supporters were predominantly rural clergymen who distrusted elite priests in Moscow. And there's one quotation. By the way, I should really thank Scott here, because I got a lot of this material from Moskovsky Tserkovny Golos, which Scott told me about, which I didn't realize, didn't know that this was the successor of Moskovsky Tserkovny Vedomosti. So this is one quote that I found in that periodical from 1917. Father Frязанов, took issue with this animosity, with this hostility by the rural clergy. He said, quote, we were under the yoke of the old diocesan satraps ourselves, and you want to put their deeds on our soldiers, on our shoulders, rather, end quote. So that's just a great pejorative term for the bishops, the diocesan satraps. Ultimately, the leadership of Moscow's united clergy prioritized church unity over the more radical agenda, and it was likely their support that tilted the balance in Tikhon's favor. So on June 21st, another vote was held in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and Tikhon was elected, receiving 481 votes against Samarin's 303. So the so-called church revolution of 1917 culminated not in schism, but in reconciliation. And the process of Tikhon's election by secret ballot was incorporated into the divine liturgy. And according to one anonymous eyewitness, ballots were cast in silence when Tikhon's victory was announced. Cries of Slava Bogu resounded throughout Russia's largest cathedral. The document of election was then taken behind the iconostasis to the altar, where it was received by the Council of Bishops. The royal doors were opened, and the 6 archpastors came out to the soleus in their robes, facing the people. The document was again read from the Amvon. Archbishop Agafangel pronounced adzios, the Greek word worthy, which the assembly then chanted thrice. It was the moment of confirmation of the election, which Greek Orthodox antiquity refers to as dokimasia. This moment marked the first popular election of a chief prelate in the history of Russia's Orthodox Church, but it was carried out according to the old Byzantine rite of ordination, according to which the hierarch is ordained through election and examination. Psefoi kai dokimasia, I believe it's pronounced. Moscow's union of clergy and laity had managed to compromise with the episcopate in the organization of this electoral process. Albeit narrowly, the election elevated a prelate to the See of Moscow who was generally acceptable to episcopate, clergy, and laity. 2 days after his election, possibly in acquiescence to Makari's canonically based protests, the synod stipulated that Tikhon would be recognized as archbishop rather than metropolitan until the coming Sobor would elevate him to the metropolitanate. So there was even some concern about those references to the canons that Makary Nevsky had been making. Tikhon's election stood for both canonicity and the broad-based version of Sobornost that was demanded by much of the clergy and laity. While overshadowed by the all-Russian Church Sobor that followed it, Moscow's diocesan revolution influenced the larger council's program of reform. So Tsvetkov, Gromoglasov, and other representatives, participants in the All-Russian Congress of Clergy and Laity, I should say organizers, these were prominent organizers of this Congress, were admitted to the pre-Sobor Council, which met on May 6th. It was first convened on May 6th. On July 5th, the Synod approved its statute on the convocation of the Sobor, which elevated the role of delegates from the laity and parish clergy far beyond the status that they had been assigned earlier by the 1906 pre-Sobor Commission, Предсоборное присутствие, in 1906. So that earlier body had wanted them to delegates from the laity and the parish clergy to participate in the Sobor on a consultative basis, whereas the right to vote would be reserved for those with apostolic authority, successors to the apostles, namely the bishops. Now, these delegates would actually vote on an equal basis with the bishops. However, the bishop's apostolic authority would be preserved through a bicameral structure, according to which a council of bishops was given veto power over the decisions of the General Assembly of the Sobor. Tikhon upheld this atmosphere of compromise when he was elected chairman of the Sobor in August. While there were heated debates, delegates also worked to find common ground on the details of church reform, including the incorporation of clergy and laity into church governance within the parameters of canon law. Bishop Serafim of Chelyabinsk, for example, suggested that the canonical authority of the bishops could be preserved if the authority of clergy and laity within diocesan administration was considered man-given and not God-given. So there was a lot of discussion for compromise. The final decree of the Sobor was that bishops would henceforth be elected from an approved list by the clergy and laity of the diocese, and that they would govern their dioceses with soborny or conciliar collaboration of the clergy and laity. One of the most lasting achievements of the Sobor was to provide the church with a final arbiter of canon law by electing Tikhon to the re-established patriarchate. After several rounds of voting for the patriarch, 3 leading candidates emerged from a field of 25: Tikhon, Arseny Stadnitsky, and Antony Khrapovitsky. The final decision was made not by vote, but by divine initiative on November 2nd, after the Kremlin had already fallen to the Bolsheviks. And amid ongoing street fighting, a massive crowd assembled once again within and around the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, where the names of the 3 final candidates were placed in a box before the iconostasis. After a lengthy prayer before the icon of the Mother of God of Vladimir, a very old hieromonach, Father Alexei, drew a slip from the box and handed it to Metropolitan Vladimir Bogayevlensky, former Metropolitan of Moscow, who read Tikhon's name and intoned Adzios. So it wasn't a democratic election in the final moment. It was decided by God, basically. The church now had a single figurehead to provide leadership and unity throughout the coming years of persecution. The ecclesiastical revolution of 1917 had resulted in the preservation of the church's canonical authority structure, but it had also secured a voice for the parish clergy and laity within that structure. The restored patriarchate would be neither monarchic nor democratic, but soborny, I would say, conciliar. The Sobor established an all-Russian church council of bishops, parish clergy, and laity as the supreme governing body. The plan of the Sobor for an inclusive conciliar church in dialogue with the modern world could not be realized under the Soviet dictatorship, but it would serve as a model for the whole of Christendom. The Sobor was the most important Orthodox council in more than 1,000 years and a forerunner of the 20th century revival of Christian conciliarism that would be taken up by the ecumenical movement and the Second Vatican Council. So in closing, I'll just make a couple of points. I think that the so-called renovationist movement is often seen as a continuation of this revolution, a continuation of the protest movement by the parish clergy. And I would argue that it was very different, that it was a major break from that, because the renovationists had no problem going against canon law. The renovationists began as a very small group, and they grew dramatically with the sponsorship of the Soviet regime beginning in 1919. So for all its radicalism, this 1917 revolutionary moment was very careful to maintain compromise. And again, what I'm arguing in this last chapter of my book is that these moves to find that compromise between the desire for an inclusive version of Sobornost, but also within parameters that were acceptable according to canon law. The parish clergy, through the institutions that they had organized, namely these Yeparchialnie Съезды, these diocesan congresses, preserved church unity and also influenced the Sobor with their kind of show of force. They ensured that the major Sobor would be a much more inclusive institution, which would have a canonical mandate, but it would also have a democratic mandate, or maybe democracy is the wrong word there, but definitely a popular mandate for the election of Tikhon. Okay, and so I'll end there. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And now it's time for questions. Please raise your hands physically or virtually and ask Daniel. While everybody try to formulate their question, I would like to note that interesting that the council, Moscow Council, elected the Patriarch Tikhon, did it, as you say, non-democratically but non-monarchically. It is interesting that they choose the old Republican practice to elect, for example, used in Venetian Republic or in Renaissance Italy, to elect by chance, by recognizing of God will. Okay, please ask your questions, and we will start discussion.
Well, I could start just by maybe making some general observations, because it's really interesting how in the last few years the kind of picture has become much more, let's say, not, I wouldn't say clear, but this conciliar movement in the last years of the Russian Empire has now, a real field. Like, you understand, we understand much better how these processes worked, both, before the war, before the revolution, let's say, in the late 19th century, the 20th century, 1905, and then around 1917, when well, you call it the revolutionary moment, or church revolution, or whatever we call it, definitely intensified, and somehow turned into something maybe, quite unexpected. We kind of, so what I felt a little bit done is that you were like looking obviously teleologically in a way, like, we know already what happened, after the Sobor, during the Soviet time, and therefore we kind of are looking for. But I think you avoided this kind of temptation kind of to explain things that happened later. So I think there are lots of open-endedness there, and history could just develop in many different ways. But maybe this I'd like very, very two kind of vague comments I'm making. But I think one thing maybe from a Baltic corner would be interesting to consider is that for these churches in the Baltic, Estonian and Latvian church, especially Estonian church, the election of a bishop was a really #1 priority. They wanted to have a suffragan bishop in 1917. And the way how they carried it was just, absolutely incredible, because we can reconstruct the whole picture. And the person who was elected as an Estonian bishop was a parish priest from St. Petersburg, Estonian by origin, or let's say, he was binational. His mother was Russian, his father was Estonian. But so the point is that, well, he was a parish priest, and that was, as far as I understand, in all this 60 plus diocesan elections, quite a precedent. So there was no similar precedents when a parish white priest who was previously married and then separated from his wife, not even divorced. So it was kind of a bit messy from that point of view. But anyway, I don't know, maybe some other cases.
Well, I didn't know that. This is what I was afraid of, as I was going to see all the things that I wrote in the book that aren't true. So one of the things that I say is that, and I blame this on Rogozny, who wrote this very excellent book about 1917. He makes the point. I think I can blame it on him. That,
I think the point is that he wasn't really like a full bishop, right, Sebastian? He was a suffragan bishop, and that could be regarded as.
But you're saying that he was elevated from the status of priest directly to bishop.
Yes.
In Riga. Okay, so. That means I made one false statement so far.
No. I mean, Rogozny, I think, mentioned it in the book, but in passing, in a footnote. But maybe, so it's like really not to kind of criticize it, but to kind of mention that these kind of parish priests against bishops wasn't so kind of clear cut. I think there was a lot of kind of bishop-centric movements as well. Like people wanted to have a bishop, and like there was this, especially in this context of ethnic orthodoxies, they wanted to have their own bishops.
Oh, that's the point that I'm making, is that they wanted to preserve the canonical structure. They wanted to have bishops, and of course, there were plenty of priests who were very traditionally. They're like Vostorgov, who were very wedded to the old system, and there were bishops who were quite radical. There were bishops who were very sympathetic to this more inclusive, broad-based form of Sobornost. So I don't want to say that there was this clear dividing line between the.
I think it's not really you. I think Rogozny probably emphasized it even more, that the church revolution equaled, the anti-bishop kind of process, or so that was a very anti-hierarchical. But I think you're kind of presenting a much more balanced view, that it was really an attempt to. Reform the church with this kind of reference to the canon law. Sorry, just one last point, also quite interesting, about how a layman could be elevated to a bishop. There was another candidate in the case of, I can't remember now, like when his candidacy came up to be an Estonian bishop, and he was also a layman, Alexander Kailas. He was a professor. And that's also interesting because he wasn't even ordained as a priest, but people voted for him as a kind of second candidate for a bishop position. So just as a reference.
Yes, thank you. We have some questions now, and first will be Scott Canworthy.
Okay, thanks, Dan. That was really interesting and great. Actually, I have just kind of a series of questions and comments. One of them, I was thinking, because it seems to me that the most comparable case to the election of Tikhon in Moscow was what happened in Petrograd with the election of Veniamin. So I don't know if you've looked into that case at all and done any comparison. That I think that would be a really interesting one, which actually I think happened even before Moscow, because Tikhon was sort of a candidate, but he didn't really rise up very high there because he wasn't known at all in Petrograd. The case of Makary and the role, I'd be curious to know more about the role of Lvov in that. He's such a kind of interesting, complicated figure, meddling and disbanding the synod, shortly after the after the February Revolution and things like this. And Makary, by the way, continued to dispute this. So even after the Sobor began in August, he was trying to presenting these petitions that he should be reinstated as the Metropolitan of Moscow, and Tikhon should be sent back to Lithuania, and all these kind of things. And they were like, hey, yeah, okay, that ship has already sailed. But it's funny how much for a long time he kept after this. Samarin, of course, is also a really interesting figure. His name also came up when they were doing the elections for the Patriarchate, but was somebody who, after the revolution, plays such an important role. He basically becomes, for a period of time, at least in 1918, the head of a delegation that is basically trying to negotiate with the Bolsheviks about things, and so he plays a really important role there. My last thought is about Tikhon's election, which they weren't following the Venetian model. They were following, sort of the Patriarchate of Alexandria. The Coptic one still follows this. Chooses by lot.
The young boy.
Yeah. So some of the ancient patriarchates had done that. What it took me a while to figure out is why they made that decision. So the reason they made that decision is because although Antony Khrapovitsky received the most votes, it was not an overwhelming majority. I mean, it was, 159 out of 350 or something like this. It was just barely over the majority. I think that had there been like an overwhelming consensus for one candidate, they would have said, okay, that's the voice of the Sobor. But it was so closely divided actually between Khrapovitsky and Arseny Stadlitsky as the two top candidates, but pretty almost evenly split, that they were like, okay, if we choose one or the other, it's going to, upset the other half of the council. So if it's in the hands of God, then everybody kind of has to be reconciled to it and accept it, and which is actually from the various firsthand accounts what actually happened. People was like, okay, this was the will of God, instead of being upset that their guy didn't get elected.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It seems that, I mean, I paid the most attention to Moscow and Tver, obviously, because that's what my book focuses on. The case of Tver is actually more interesting, I think, but maybe less consequential than in Moscow. But the place of voting, the Vybornaya Nachala, in the selection of prelates is definitely something that is being worked out. It's not entirely clear. So what happens in Tver is that Serafim Chichagov is asked to leave by the diocesan congress. And he does the same thing as Makary. He kind of says, okay. And then he also has a change of heart and started sending off these furious telegrams everywhere saying, I didn't mean it, I didn't mean it. And it seems that his personal clout within the episcopate is what allowed him to actually reverse the decision. Unlike, I don't think Makary was terribly respected now that Rasputin was gone. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but he seems to have been, definitely in Moscow, he was not very well liked. But Makary ends up, not Makary, sorry, Seraphim in Tver ends up being replaced by his own vicar bishop, whose name I believe is Arseny. So Arseny takes over as bishop, and then there's this back and forth, and the synod doesn't know what to do, and so they hold another election, ultimately, another diocesan congress, hoping that Seraphim will be elected, and he's not. Arseny is elected, but they still put Seraphim back in place. So there's this kind of, as you say, there's this desire to gather a kind of consensus in certain cases, without it being really a democratic election, but there's a desire to gather a popular mandate, at least. The figure of Lvov is definitely interesting, and there was a funny moment when he attacked I can't remember his name. He was I believe it was the rector of Moscow Seminary. No, Theological Academy, I'm sorry. It was the rector of Theological Academy. Lvov went to him and sort of as Makary's ally and said, your history. And this guy said, we answer to the synod, we answer to the bishops, not to the overprocurator. And Lvov says the overprocurator is higher than the bishops. So that was a very interesting case of government power being used, as I said before, not to turn the tables on the Episcopal party, not to necessarily make it democratic, but simply to use government power in the opposite direction. And again, I think that that's what the renovationists were all about, and Lvov became a renovationist. And your other comment about Petrograd, I don't remember that so well, to be honest. I read about it a while ago when I was writing this chapter, but the similarity you're referring to, I'm not sure I recall.
Thank you. Next question from Anastasia Akulic.
Thank you so much. This is so incredibly interesting. And I was thinking particularly in regards, so what is happening in Moscow in this period, because I'm looking at China and the Orthodox mission there, is really unpopular with the missionaries in China. They will, because of that, split with Moscow later on. And one of the critiques that they have against it is that this is essentially a Protestant process so far as they're concerned, in every regard, in regard to the property being controlled by the parish, in regard to the lay people having a say in terms of, in the council, and they're just not happy about this whatsoever. At the same time, what I found really, really interesting was the fact that actually quite a lot of the time, even the monastic members of the clergy in China, who were sent to China, were actually had sort of a lay background. So the bishop there at the time, Bishop Benekinti, he was originally a lay priest who was also widowed. And after that, he actually really quickly rose through the ranks and became an archimandrite when they wanted someone to be sent to China. And then afterwards, he really quickly becomes a bishop because they wanted to elevate the archimandrite in China to the seat of the bishop. And a very similar thing happens in the 1950s when they decide that they need a Chinese bishop to lead the mission, when in 1950s they really quickly need to get a Chinese bishop. And I was thinking that that was sort of a continuation of that tradition in the mission, but I was wondering now whether they were bringing in those practices of really quickly elevating because I think what happened with Bishop Vasily Yao, the first Chinese bishop, who was, I think, Hiratanis in 1956, is that he was a fairly experienced lay priest with, I don't know if he was married or if he was widowed, if he was widowed or if he was never married. But what happened with him is that he really quickly took the holy orders and then traveled to Moscow to be elevated to the rank of the bishop. And I'd be really interested to work out whether that's sort of something that comes from the missionary experience, whether that's something that comes from the Orthodox practice in Moscow, or whether those two sort of come together. That'd be really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Anastasia. It's nice to see you in person, and that's really fascinating. I'm glad you came. Yeah, I don't know about the missionaries abroad. I mean, I did write something about the internal missionaries. And they do tend to be extremely conservative and extremely wedded to the Tsarist state, because what they end up doing within the Russian Empire is to use the laws privileging orthodoxy to it's too bad Heather's not here anymore, to kind of prevent encroachment on their territory by other confessions, by other faiths. So what I find is that rather than engaging in a lot of proselytizing or what we might think of as missionary work, they would simply call the police when they found that Baptists are trying to talk to the Orthodox or anyone else. And so, yeah, frequently those kinds of missionaries would have been far more conservative. So, but as far as the bishops abroad, outside of the empire who are going to China, I don't know very much about them. And I guess Scott would be better to answer the question about the lay origins of a lot of these monastics. That is something that I noticed in Turkestan, which is what I'm doing my research on right now. Looking at the monastery down there, there were a lot of peasants who became monks.
Thank you. I saw Sebastian's raised hand before. No. Then the next question from Paul Valier. Paul.
Thanks, Andre. Dan, wonderful material, as always, just so rich, so much to talk about. One comment and then a question, and they're not really related. The comment about the finale, the Sobor, which you show how that kind of emerges out of the Moscow experience and much more. You use the word compromise repeatedly, and what you show was certainly a compromise. It's not that the word is out of place. Nevertheless, compromise is a political term. And while the political options, monarchic and democratic, were definitely there and they were represented, nevertheless, what came out really was something that transcended those terms. It was a kind of religious instantiation of a religious ideal that was political, but also trans-political. That's not a criticism of you, but you see what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
In terms of the language that you use, compromise is absolutely appropriate. I'm not saying it's not, but you might want to find another word as well to emphasize that there really was some kind of a religious accomplishment, breakthrough there in the church in 1917. And that's just a suggestion to throw out to you. Here's my question. It has to do with Sobornost and Canonichnost. in your source material, what's the earliest instance in your source material where these two notions come together? Because they are separable, and you know, they weren't necessarily a pair in the middle and late 19th century. By the предсоборное присутствие, of course, they are a pair. You know, they're constantly being referred to. But in your source material, what's the earliest documentation for this sort of very important conjunction of terms?
Yeah, the only case that I saw of the two terms being elided was that quotation by that professor, Myshkin, I think is his name. And he is quoted in that book by Igumen Sava, the Eparchialnie Reformy. So that's where I found that. But yeah, the two ideas are definitely, I recognize that they're different, but they have an interesting relationship in these discussions in 1917.
And the mission, do you know what year that was?
I don't right now, but I can find it for you.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I'll write you about it.
Yeah,
no problem.
but I mean, it was late 19th century at the earliest, maybe even early 20th century that he was saying that. Yeah, there are a lot of surprising statements by these professors of canon law at that point, and Zaozersky is really interesting, but many of them were quite maybe quite radical, you could say.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Thank you. We have two more questions. First one from Irina.
Maybe who hasn't spoken yet, because I've already asked my question before. I just had a short comment to understand. Okay, Scott has already also spoken. Okay, let me just quickly pause. How do I do it? I pause the recording. Is it paused? Just to make a quick remark about Anastasia's comment, and somehow related also to this discussion about canonichность and canonicity. Or so, if I see, you know, correctly, that 1917 was probably the only time when the Orthodox Church was kind of, you know, really free from the pressure of the state. And therefore, most of these questions that have been, you know, in a kind of very messy way decided at these church conciliar institutions, they were really like looking for mechanism how to settle their questions without the state. And that kind of situation didn't have precedence, because what happened after, you know, what was before was again, you know, a pressure from the state. And what Anastasia asked about, you know, what were these canonical? I mean, there was, of course, KGB, and this was the main mechanism why bishops were elected and who was elevated as bishops. And the canonical rules came secondary. Yeah.
I'll just make one comment in response to that. I think that even in the Soviet period, what was canonical remained important to the laity, and that's one reason why the renovationists were rejected, because they were put in place, they were elevated by state power rather than the canonical procedure of the church. And what happened in 1917 and 18, where the church did manage to remain intact, I think is very important for the inability ultimately of the regime to do what they were trying to do, which was to divide and conquer and fragment the church and sponsor the renovationists merely to divide the Orthodox and weaken them.
Yes, thank you. And the next question from Scott.
Yeah, also just like Irina, some kind of follow-up discussion and comments. So happy to give the floor to anyone else who has questions. But I totally agree with Paul that there is this element of compromise, but at the same time, it's like there's something that's beyond compromise. And there's this marvelous, extremely thick volume, the Дело Великого Строительства Церковного, that has all these kind of firsthand accounts of participants in the Sabor. And I remember distinctly reading somebody, I can't remember who now though, commenting about how when the Sabor began, it felt like this kind of like a parliament, that there was political factions and, kind of debates. But as the Sabor kept going, the atmosphere and the process transformed and became something different. It really became Soborny. I like that the comment you made that it was, not monarchic, not democratic, it was Soborny. And that this is, somehow in the process of the Sabor itself, this actually takes place. And there's also comments about how, when the Sabor starts, nobody had ever done anything like this before, right? This was all totally new for a lot of the clergy to do something like this, but of course, completely new for the laity, and that they would have, in addition to the sessions of the Sabor and the separate addieli that were considering specific issues, they would have lectures and stuff like that in the evenings. And a lot of those were precisely to kind of educate the laity and others about things like canon law and church history and things like this, to give them a deeper sense of what they were participating in. And it seems to have worked, right? And you really get this sense by the end of the Sabor, or as it's going on, that the laity, as much as many of the clergy, obviously you have some individual outliers like Titlinov and so on who are critical of what's going on. But this sense that the laity are not actually pushing anything particularly radical as time goes on, but actually, if anything, they want to keep the church structure properly orthodox and all that kind of stuff. That's one thought. Just a few quick other things. Of course, monastics by the early 20th century, the majority of them come from the peasantry. But that was like real monks, right? Not so they wouldn't be people who get an education, and so therefore, in 99% of the cases, were not candidates for the episcopate. Missionaries, I know from what I deal with in North America, from when Tikhon was there, their external missionaries are totally different beast than the internal missionaries. So the kind of missionaries you're talking about, the ones who are fighting against Baptists and other sectarians inside Russia, are very different kind of people than the missionaries, at least I don't know how it is in China, but than the ones who end up in North America, who, by the way, after 1905 are really like radically embracing the whole idea of Sobornost. And there's some, I guess when it's my turn, I'll talk about some of those kinds of things, because the stuff they say is really interesting. Yeah. Oh, and one last final thing about the renovationists. I agree with you completely about your analysis there. And I just pick on one case. So when Tikhon was in North America, he struggled really long and hard to get an assistant bishop for Alaska. And the person who was finally sent to Alaska was Innokenty Pustinsky, who became a renovationist later on. And we know from Innokenty's letters that he was writing back to Russia that he was highly critical of Tikhon, precisely because he felt like Tikhon gave too much authority to his priests. Like, he doesn't rule his diocese with a firm fist like his predecessor did. He needs to have more authority and, this kind of stuff. It's like Tikhon was administering the diocese in this very Soborny fashion. And Innokenty Pustinsky thought this was like chaos and disarray and disorder and stuff like that. And he's the one who becomes the renovationist. This about what kind of people they attracted, who they wanted the power in a different place than with the bishops, but it wasn't necessarily with the people.
Absolutely, yeah, that's what I've seen as well. Yeah, I just want to say, you and Paul make a great point about this. I forget the words he used exactly. It was kind of beautiful, but it's this sort of a transcendence of the political to form this religious consensus. And what I'm arguing in the book, and I don't look at the Sobor itself that closely. The book is not about the Sobor, it's about everything that leads up to it. Maybe I should have made it longer and included the Sobor, but I think that all that the parish clergy were doing up until that point was crucial for the Sobor to be possible in the form that it took, because they were organizing these kinds of meetings of people to work out everything from banal issues of finances to keep the church afloat to humanitarian relief campaigns and to education, whereas the bishops were not allowed to meet outside of the synod. The only time the bishops ever met or did anything vaguely subordinate was the missionary congresses. And so the capacity, first of all, what I'm trying to argue today is that the capacity of the laity, the clergy, to work out, for lack of a better term, a compromise, was due to the fact that the parish clergy had developed these institutions, this practice over the previous 100 years, or a little less than that, of meeting together to try to solve the problems that they encountered. And so I think that this, what I call in the book, the pastoral movement, this attempt to incorporate lay participation into church life in order, as a means of persuading the laity to support what the clergy were doing, that influenced what orthodoxy was. That, I think, changed slightly Orthodox spirituality. It made the religious life and the practice of orthodoxy slightly different. It was a contribution to the practice of orthodoxy, and I think that it must have had a profound impact on the ability of Russian Orthodox society to come together and do this Sobor.
Thank you, Daniel. And before we will move to maybe the last two questions, I would like to clarify from Scott. When you, what did you mean when you told about that atmosphere became more and more subordinate in the council? What is it? What did you mean? What principle you can describe as a subordinate, which is opposite to the very beginning of with debates and so on, with parliamentarian principle?
I guess I'll have to look back at my notes from that text to see how the description was of the person who said it, but the effect of it was kind of a political atmosphere, like you have your vested interests of sort of the group that you're a part of or that you represent or something like this, and it through this process that people overcame the factionalism and they began to work towards what was best for the church as a whole rather than what was the best that served the interests of their particular faction or group, something like that.
Oh, okay.
Andrei, also, if you look at Sergei Bulgakov's Napiru Bogov, he says exactly the same thing. Scott is saying the character, the Svietsky Bogoslov, I believe, as I recall, says something like, the council looked like a constitutional democratic assembly, but once you actually got into it, it became something else. It became subordinate. Bulgakas napiru Bogov. That would be one place to find that sentiment.
Thank you so much, Scott and Paul. Following to the very end of our today's seminar, because we are talking more than an hour and a half, and I would like to thank Daniel for his very interesting presentation, and all participants for this discussion. We knew a lot, I think, from this discussion, and a lot of interesting cases. And in the very end, I would like to give a floor for conclusion to Irina. Please, Irina.
Well, thank you so much. I haven't, well, I haven't not much to say. I just want to draw attention to people who are watching this webinar to Daniel's new book. I don't know if one can see it on the screen. Russia, Social Gospel, the Orthodox Pastoral Movement in Famine, War and Revolution. And the themes that have been discussed are, constitute only one part of the book. And from, what we heard today is that this is definitely one area of the study of the Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church in particular, that hasn't really been very much discussed. The role of the parish priests in making of this conciliar process and conciliar movement that led to the Sobor. I think the phrase that Dan has said, or sorry, I just can't remember, one of you, Scott or Dan, that the parish priests, in fact, they had all the instruments that even the bishops didn't have at the time. So, and they could use these instruments. And that's really important to think about, and what happened after and what's happening now. Where are these instruments, which the parish clergy can use today, and for example, and is there anything they could learn from their predecessors, in 1917 and before? So I think there's a lot to think and reflect on. And so thank you very much for drawing attention again to this issue. So as I said, we will keep you posted about our next events, and so
can I just say a last couple words here? So again, I want to thank you, Irina, for inviting me to this. I think this was such a fascinating seminar, and it was a real honor to present at it. And I just, because all of these people are gathered together, I have to say that my work is so much indebted to the work of, in particular, Scott, also you, Irina, and definitely Paul, and of course Greg, who is gone now. But I'm glad he showed up. I really built on everything that you all have written, and I couldn't have done it without you, and also your kindness and your generosity with your time and helping me with my work over the years. So thank you all so much, and it's a real honor to kind of try to explain it to you.
Yeah, okay, so well, goodbye, and we'll be gathering again and seeing you all again. So